Jesus Christ. The first reason is that they being people, have been told something their entire life. And the more you hear something, the more you're going to believe it. There's actually one quote, it's an anonymous author, as far as I am aware of, and he said, it's a lot easier to believe a lie you've been told 1,000 times than to believe the truth that you've only been told one time. And that's so true. The volume that you hear something, and that is not just how loud you hear it, but how many times you are told something as truth, you're going to believe it a lot more so than the minority that you rarely ever hear. So you can see how that's an improper motivation. Another one that's very closely related to it is people believe something because that's what their parents believed. Either because they just simply like heritage for the sake of heritage's sake, or because, you know, their parents are right about how to change the oil in the car, they're right about the recipe for great chocolate chip cookies or whatever, and so they must be right about what they believe in Jesus Christ. And so they're not believing it because there's good reasons for it, there's good logos for it, but because their parents simply believe it and they're going to believe it. That's not a good motivation. And I'll give you a story, a really good story from the book Muscle and a Shovel, which is actually advertised in that ad that I just ran. There's a story in there about cutting off the end of the ham. And you may have heard of this before. This man and woman were at Thanksgiving. They were married, and this wife was hosting Thanksgiving for the first time. So she's in the kitchen with her husband. He's helping her prepare the ham, and she takes a knife and cuts off the end of the ham, like a third of this ham, perfectly good. And the husband's just, oh, why did you do that? And she says, what do you mean, why did I do that? And he's like, why did you cut off a third of a perfectly good ham? And she said, well, because my mom always did it. And he said, call her in here. And so she calls her in here and she says, Mom, why did you always cut off the end of the ham at Thanksgiving when you were preparing it? And she thought to herself, well, because my mom always did it. And so they call in Grandma and said, Grandma, why did you always cut off the end of the ham? And she said, well, back in my day, I only had a pan that was yay big and the ham hung over it, so I had to cut it off so I could fit it in the oven to bake it. And you can see the ludicrousness behind keeping that tradition going. There's maybe good reason for the initial generation to do it, but because the children did what the parents did, just because the parents did it, there was no good reason. Perfectly good ham, rather, was wasted in the process. And just like that, with faith, with religion, people believe improperly because their parents believe in it, either for the sake of heritage's sake or because they must be right, because they're my parents. A third improper motivation for faith is putting faith in your pastor, as they're called today, preacher, elder of the church, priest, whoever, because they have authority, because they have studied a lot. Maybe they've been to seminary or something. And I'll just tell you honestly, they're not all preaching the same thing. And if they're not all preaching the same thing, that means they can't all be right. And so maybe we shouldn't put our faith in a religious expert just because he's been to seminary or just because he has a title or a seat of authority or whatever. There are people with authority, with expertise that are wrong all the time. Just watch the news. The fourth motivator that's improper for why we believe what we believe is that, unfortunately, it suits people's lifestyle to believe certain things. And if you bring somebody to the brink of being saved, I've heard this before, I'm not even joking, they'll say, I'm not going to obey the gospel because if I do that, then I'm going to have to change this about my life, and I don't want to. For some people, it's partying on the weekends. They like the bottle. They like sleeping with their girlfriend, and they don't want to change that stuff. They like using foul language. It makes them cool at work or whatever. That is the worst reason for believing what you believe, and hopefully that describes nobody here. Now let's get into talking about the definition, defining what is saving faith. And in order to do that, I like to start off talking about doubt.